Hi guys, in this lesson we're going to take a look at the Draggable interaction helper. It does exactly what you'd expect. It makes things draggable by the mouse. All of the interaction helpers are highly configurable, so have APIs consisting of mostly configurable options, and Draggable is no exception. It exposes only the common API methods destroy, disable, enable, option and widget, and a small selection of useful events like create, drag, start and stop, which are triggered when they occur on the element being dragged. Draggable is often used in conjunction with the droppable interaction helper, and we'll take a look at this in the next lesson, but it doesn't have to be used with droppable. The dialog widget that we looked at in the first course, for example, is draggable, and although we can drop it in the sense that we can stop dragging it, it doesn't use the droppable interaction helper to do anything special when it's dropped, so it's perfectly usable on its own. We don't need much in the way of underlying markup. We can make pretty much any element we want draggable simply by selecting it and calling the init method on it. So let's set up the example file. And we'll open this up as a new website. So it's on the desktop. And let's just create a new HTML file. And we'll call this one Draggable. And let's just make a couple of changes to this. Don't like the XML namespace, so we'll change that for lang. Let's give it a title. Now we need to link to the CSS. And the CSS file that we want to link to is actually inside of the base folder, and it's the jQuery UI CSS one. Okay, that should be all we need. And now we want to link to the script file for jQuery UI and the one for jQuery itself as well. Let's not forget that. Just being lazy by copying the file names here. It's probably quicker than typing it out. And now we want the source file for jQuery UI. Okay, so we'll just make a simple div draggable. And then we want a custom script file so that we can initialize it and set options and stuff. So we'll just stick this in the standard jQuery ready handler. And then to make an element draggable, we just select it and call the draggable init method. So we probably want to give the draggable element some CSS as well, just so that we can actually see it. So we'll just use a style tag here. We wouldn't normally do that, obviously, but just for the purposes of this example, it should be fine. Okay, that should do it. Let's take a look at a browser. Okay, and now our square is draggable. So it's pretty straightforward. Without configuration, the selected element will just be draggable. Nothing else will happen. If that's all we want, then we're pretty much sorted at this point. But if we do want more than that, it's got a wide range of configurable options. There are too many options for me to just reel off here. It wouldn't really provide any value. So let's look at some of them in some loose groupings that they can be put into. So there are a few options that are related to how the element being dragged moves around the page. These include axes, containment, grid, snap, snap mode, and snap tolerance. The axes option is useful to restrict the axis of travel. So if we wanted the element only to be draggable on the horizontal axis, then we could configure this option. So let's do that quickly. So when we want to configure before initialization, then we pass an object containing the keys that we'd like to configure to the init method. So let's do that. And the one that we're interested in now is axis, and we can set that to X, and then it will only be draggable on the horizontal axis. So let's confirm that. So I'm trying to drag it down, it won't do it, so it just drags left and right. So that can be pretty useful in some situations. Or we could just supply Y instead of X, and it would enable just up and down dragging. The grid option is pretty similar. It allows travel along both the vertical and horizontal axes, but only in straight lines, so the Draggable can only move along an imaginary grid that's applied to the page. This option accepts an array with 2 items, and each item refers to the pixel size of the edges of the square that make up the grid. So let's have a quick look at this. We'll get rid of the axis option, and we'll use grid instead, and we supply an array. And if we say that the sides of the grid square should be 100 by 100, so now we can move it left or right, but it kind of jumps along each square of the grid. See? So again, that can be pretty useful depending on what it is we're actually building. The snap options are all related to one another, as you can probably guess. By default, snap is set to false, but we can set it to either true, which makes the Draggable snap to all other Draggables, or we can pass it a selector, and then the Draggable will snap to just the element matching the selector. The snap mode allows us to specify whether the Draggable should snap to the outer or inner edges of the element being snapped to, and the snap tolerance determines the distance from the element being snapped to before snapping occurs. The containment option can also take a selector, among other things, like a DOM element, a string, or an array. When it is passed to selector or DOM element, that element becomes the parent of the Draggable, and the Draggable cannot escape its bounds. We can also supply one of the strings parent, document, or window, and one of these will then become the container of the Draggable. Using an array is pretty cool. We don't even need to specify an element as the container. We can just pass an array to this option instead, which should contain 4 items. These items are the pixel coordinates of the corners of a square that becomes the Draggable's container. So let's just set that one now. So we'll get rid of the grid one, but we'll keep the array because we'll use that. And we'll change the items in the array. We'll go 10, 10, 500, 500. So this will give us a 500 by 500 square, which the Draggable cannot escape from. So let's take a look. So we can't move it up or left. We can move it right until we hit the edge of our square. So now the Draggable is contained. And again, that can be pretty useful depending on what it is we're building. We've also got a range of options that can affect the styling of the Draggable or change its visual appearance in some way. These are add class, cursor, cursor at, helper, opacity, revert, revert duration, stack, and z-index. The add classes option allows us to disable the default class name being added to a Draggable during initialization. It's really only useful if you're working with a really large number of Draggables that get initialized at the same time, and this option just stops the class name being added, so that's one less thing that needs to be done to each Draggable when it's initialized, and it just kind of speeds up the initialization, and we can just pass false to that option. The cursor option allows us to specify the CSS name of the cursor icon to use, but bear in mind that this cursor is only applied while the draggable is actually being dragged. It doesn't get added when the element is just hovered over. The cursor at option allows us to position the draggable relative to the pointer. This can be set using an object with a suitable combination of the keys top, left, bottom and right. The revert option makes the draggable return to its start position after the drag ends, and the revert duration is the duration of the revert animation which occurs. So these are both pretty simple to use as well. The helper option adds another element which gets dragged instead of the draggable. We can pass it either a string or a function. The string can accept the value clone so that a copy of the draggable gets created and used as the helper, or we can pass it a function which should return the element to use as the helper. Let's add one now. So let's try adding the clone option first of all. So what we're expecting is that our square should get copied, right? It's not actually what happens completely. So when we start dragging, it looks like nothing is happening. So we can't see the new helper. And there's a very good reason for that. The helper will be given the class name UEDraggable, and this class name is also given to any draggable elements themselves. So if we just inspect this in the DOM viewer here, we can see that the draggable has the UEDraggable class, and if we start dragging, then we see another div element gets added with the class UEDraggable, and it also has UEDraggable dragging because the drag is in progress. And if we move it around, we see the left and the top values get updated. So something is definitely being dragged, we just can't see it. So the best way to fix that, instead of using this ID here to provide some styling, which is a bit rubbish at the best of times, we can change it to our UEDraggable class name. And now when we start dragging, there's our helper. So this time it is a copy, and it picks up the same styling by virtue of the class name. So the lesson here is to always use the class name to add styling to Draggables if you're going to use helpers. And you'll notice also that the helpers always revert at the end of the drag, but there is no revert animation. They just get removed from the DOM instantly. There are a series of options that control whether or not dragging can actually occur. These are cancel, delay, distance and handle. The cancel option takes a selector and will cancel dragging on any draggable that matches the selector. So if some of our draggables were divs and some were different elements, we could stop the divs being draggable by using the cancel option, as long as we spell it correctly. And when we reload the page now, get rid of the DOM viewer for now, then we can see that dragging does not occur. The delay and distance options can be used to prevent accidental drags. Both of these options take integers. The delay is the time in milliseconds after a mouse down before the drag begins. So we can configure it so that the mouse button needs to be held down for a short time to begin dragging. With distance, the number is the distance in pixels that the pointer needs to move while the mouse button is held down after clicking on a draggable. So both of these options can be used to prevent accidental drags. The handle option is useful because it allows us to specify that the drag can only begin if the handle itself is clicked. So a good example of this again is the dialog widget, which can only be dragged when the title bar is clicked. So in that case, the title bar is the handle for the draggable. This option takes a selector or DOM element as its value. And lastly, there are a couple of miscellaneous options like append to, connect to sortables, iframe fix, refresh positions, and scope. The append to option just controls which element the helper is appended to. The connect to sortables option is useful only if we're using sortables as well, and as we haven't looked at these, it's not really worth looking at this option in any great detail. The iframe fix option is useful if you're using iframes on the page, as well as the cursor at option. And what this does is just stop the events that get fired by the Draggable being triggered inside the iframe as well. The refresh positions option can be useful if you've got a lot of Draggables on the page and the system needs to know the positions of the Draggables at all times, but be aware that this option can impact performance considerably. So it's only going to be needed in very limited situations. So in this lesson we looked at the Draggable interaction helper. We saw that its API consists mostly of configurable options, exposing just the common API methods, and a few events. In the next lesson, we'll look at the Draggables interaction helper. Thanks for watching.